Free Spirit Academy is about the freedom to be fully yourself, beyond any trauma that may have been accumulated through our families, religions, education systems, cultural conditioning, and beyond. Our bodies hold our trauma, but they also hold our truth. My name is Randy Moss. I practice eating psychology coaching and somatic experiencing, and I'm grateful that you're here for these talks and conversations. In my mid-20s, I had been binge eating since I was about 12 and emotionally eating and pretty consumed with food for as long as I can remember. And equally as long, I had been trying to fix it. And I had read everything from very spiritual approaches that said mindful eating was the answer, to very emotional approaches that said I needed to heal all of my childhood wounding to heal my relationship with food, to very straightforward approaches like brain over binge that said I could just stop. And every time, of course, I thought I had found my answer. I would be walking around on a cloud with my new little plan, and I was never going to binge again. And anywhere from hours to days to weeks later, I'd be in my familiar pattern of just losing it. So losing myself in food and promising myself this was the last time and I would start over tomorrow. And there was a kind of high in it. A high from the release of the control and this absolute rush of starting again the next day, which of course would be completely perfect. And the whole cycle kept me from having to touch shame very deeply. It wasn't just that I ate when I was emotional and that itself was the problem. It was every element kept me from having to feel. So the excitement of how glowy and healthy and thin and vibrant I was going to be when I really committed to my pristine diet, and then the release of control in the binge, and then the beating myself up in the way that I was most familiar with because not telling myself how disappointed I was would have felt wrong. And yes, the do-over, the fresh start. Shame drove the entire cycle, but I never truly felt it. I never fully felt it. I couldn't have told you what it felt like in my body. And if you'd asked what I'd have said, in those moments, I was beating myself up, and that was shame. When I realized that I wasn't going to be able to stop eating, or I'm feeling just how much I've eaten, and I'm yelling at myself, that was what I thought shame was. But shame thoughts, especially when they're the ones that we've been conditioned to believe, can just be a distraction from shame feelings. And being able to feel was a huge part of finally disrupting this pattern, this cycle. And trust me, I thought I was feeling. It felt unbearable to be so full, so stuffed that I could sometimes just throw up without considering myself a bulimic because it wasn't like I tried to do it. When I was that full, it was like I could feel nothing but that fullness. I couldn't focus. I couldn't connect with anyone. I couldn't let myself be seen. All I could do was plan how good the next day was going to be. And I just remember berating myself to feel this, like just feel how terrible and awful and bad this feels, and we are never going to do this again. But of course we would. I would. Because I was never actually touching the shame, just running from it, reacting to it. And what we avoid, we continue to circle back around to in this crazy magnetic way. I really think that we all, after our basic needs are met, just want to feel safe and free to be ourselves and to live as ourselves and create what feels good to create and connect in a way that feels real and not like we're trying to impress or live up to someone else's expectations. And I was chasing freedom and safety in a sort of roundabout way, trying to conquer my body and my health with the assumption that then I can be my true self, and then I can live my life fully, and then I can look people in the eye without shame and speak up rather than being embarrassed. Because it just felt so obvious that my body was the problem and my lack of discipline was the problem. Despite sometimes being able to control myself enough to get somewhere close to the body I thought I should have, and still just kind of being me in there, unsatisfied and embarrassed and feeling like something was off. So when I first started actually being able to undo this cycle, what was needed was, okay, it meant the whole thing looked the same. So the diet, binge, beat self up, start over cycle looked the same. But I engaged with myself inside of it differently. So the beat myself up part was different. It didn't look exactly like that. From the outside, it did, right? Because that was happening so internally anyways. And I was getting into this feeling work, and I knew I had to engage the pattern differently. And I couldn't stop the binge, but I could not beat myself up. I could actually feel a feeling, and it did not feel good, and it did not feel right, and it was not what my nervous system had wired in is safe. It felt very unsafe and very wrong. But taking myself back to this, I had binged, and rather than bracing my body and staying in my head and looping in my head, I softened a little and felt the fullness in my belly while telling myself I was okay and that I wasn't mad. And this was really big. This was really big. I asked myself not just what fullness felt like, but how I felt about the fullness. And that's where this heat came into my chest and my belly, and it was rage, and I wanted to scream and cry and destroy myself. And as that passed, it became shame, or shame became apparent. And I almost stopped there because it felt like jumping off a cliff. But somehow I softened my belly again, and in a way, it did feel like jumping off a cliff internally somehow, without the shame story being focused on. It was just a feeling of constriction, like in my esophagus, and this falling into my gut, just like this, gutted air knocked out of me feeling. And eventually that passed too. And I didn't know, I didn't know what it was going to do. I didn't come in with expectations that I'm going to feel it to heal it, or I'm going to feel it so it'll go away. I just had to do something differently. And I was worming my way around, and that's what happened. And it wasn't that I felt it this one time and that fixed everything. Versions of this had to happen again and again. And the more I did this, the less scary it was, the less capacity, or the more capacity I had to hold it. It didn't feel like jumping off of a cliff so much. Part of my process was making binge eating safe and okay. So that had to come in too. There were a variety of pieces that really had to be in place. But just with this, a piece of the cycle had been broken. I had stepped out of the urgency of saying, doing the thing where I was like, this is the last day I'm going to do this. I'm never going to do this again. It was not going to be so black and white anymore. It was going to be messy and piecey and one step at a time. And this was one piece. So there was no longer going to be the beating up of myself. Not that it wouldn't be automatic and running in my brain, but it was a shifting of focus and a bringing in of another voice that was like, we're not doing that anymore. And I came to know that I could survive the rage and the shame whirlwind without, and this is important too, without it driving me to reach for another perfect diet to fix things. Big, this was so big. There is so much talk about feeling feelings, and it can feel like, well, if I do that, I'll just do horrible things. And the horrible things we reach for are often a reaction to what we're only feeling on the surface. It's not a true holding of a feeling. So, like I said, that wasn't everything. There were other pieces in place to truly undo all of the years of habit surrounding food in my body. And and now that I'm thinking about it, all of the pieces that I mentioned in the beginning, I read this and I read that. Like there was the mindfulness and there was the undoing of the childhood wounds. Like it was all of that, but none of it explained well how to actually feel the body and hold a feeling and what a feeling was, and that it wasn't just thoughts in my head, and that it wasn't reacting to a feeling. None of it explained that. And as I'm saying this too, and I'm going a bit off script because I sort of write an outline for this. This is why I'm doing this podcast, because the moments that I found of people describing what feeling actually was were and have been so useful and so helpful for me. So I hope that this is helpful. Nothing would have changed without that piece being in place and without my body becoming a safe home for shame to express and to find a new and more true way of being. I hope you enjoyed this episode. For more updates on courses, classes, one-on-one mentorships, and more, go to randymoss.com, RANDEMOSS.com, and thank you so much for listening.